And we're live.
Hello, this is Lukas C. Dodds, and welcome to this episode of Angular Air. This is episode 23, where we are going to be talking with Kent C. Dodds, my fraternal twin, about formally. So let's introduce the guest. We have Kent C. Dodds and
Hello.
Jeff Welpley, my other partner in crime, and Patrick J.S., my favorite dirty hipster. Thanks for joining
Good.
us, guys. And let's get some announcements just out of the way. And so, first and foremost, tune into the next show, Angular and Module Loading, with Guy Bedford. He created JSPM, and that'll be on July 21st. Super excited about that. Also, follow us on Twitter and Google Plus at Angular Air. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask on Twitter using hashtag NGAirQuestions. So before we get started, let's see if we have any questions. Q&A. Nope, no questions so far. So with that said, let us move along. So, Kent, inquiring minds want to know, what is angularformly and what does it do?
So angularformly, put simply, is a simple abstract, well, it's a complex abstraction on top of Angular forms to make Angular forms more simple. It's a little bit more of an imperative API where Angular forms by default are more declarative in your templates. Angularformly accepts a field configuration or an array of field configuration objects. And then you pass those into the formally form directive, and that will spit out your form for you. And you also pass in the model that you want that form bound to, and it will do all of the magic of ng model binding so that your formally form represents the state of the model, and it is represented by the configuration that you give it.
So there's sort of people that like the imperative way of doing things and people that like the declarative way of doing things. What's your kind of personal opinion on that discussion, and kind of how do you suit? And you mentioned a little bit about how formally suits that, but like what's your kind of personal thoughts around that sort of thought process?
Yeah, so I'll be totally honest in saying that I think I'm still trying to figure out what imperative and declarative really actually mean. But basically, what I've found is that the template it just gets way too verbose, and you repeat yourself way too much when you're trying to do forms with Angular. So you can have your input, and it has an ng model, and that's great. But then you need to have a class on it so that you can style it properly, and then you need to have a label for it. And if you want to have a label and you want it to be accessible, then you need an ID and a for that label to be associated with that input. And then you need to worry about validation, and so you have your ng messages for that, and then you need to worry about a whole myriad of other things. And it just gets really hairy, and there are just so many things that you really you don't want to have to repeat yourself over and over for everything. And so what Angular formally promises is the ability to keep your forms dry, and that allows or makes it a lot easier to first make it easier to maintain your forms because you have really just one or two places where all labels or label associated things go, and so everything looks the same because it's using the exact same code. And you don't have to create an entire directive just to make a label for your field. You can do that, and you can use that with formally, but the difference is, without formally, you have to put that directive next to every single one of your inputs, and it's just a lot of extra work. Whereas with Angular formally, it's a lot more terse, and your form is basically just represented as a JSON object or a JavaScript object, you can also have functions in there. So yeah, and that's like maybe another bit of a subject. But yeah, like I think that Angular 2 is going the right direction in that they allow you to both use an imperative and a declarative approach where it makes sense. Because I think there are some places in my app that I don't use angularformly because it doesn't make sense. It's a very small form, or like it's a single field or something like that. It really doesn't make sense to have an entire angularformly form in there. But with Angular 2, being able to allow you to have both imperative and declarative, I think will hopefully render angularformly not necessary. That's kind of my hope, is that with Angular 2, I'll be able to make an Angular 2 version of Formally, and then help people migrate away from Angular Formally onto regular Angular 2 with the all the benefits of having the imperative approach for your forms that allows you to keep your stuff dry and whatever else. So, long question to a short, or long answer to a short question.
Yeah. So you would say that this is more formal way of dealing with forms?
A more formal way of dealing with forms? I'm not sure.
I see what you did there. Ha ha.
I was way over my head.
That was a joke.
Because it's formally. Yeah. All right. So
actually, speaking of that,
they both have form.
I watch Formally on Twitter, and like in TweetDeck, I have like a search so that I don't miss tweets about Formally, and people misspell the word formally like all the time, and I have to like wade through all the misspellings of formally so that I see my Formally stuff. It's kind of a mess, but anyway.
At least like you get like highly target like SEO juice or whatever towards those key terms.
Yeah.
And exactly it's for you.
Yeah, that's true.
So like more on what you said, like it's really hard to figure out the distinction between declarative and imperative. With your approach, it actually makes a lot of sense because what you did is essentially what you're supposed to do, and that is you use the current abstractions, whatever primitives Angular gives you, but then after you reach a certain point, you create an abstraction on top of that, and you make it simpler for you to reason about and for you to maintain. And that's essentially what Angular formally gives you, is because like when you're dealing with a lot of forms, you need this abstraction. Otherwise, maintaining it's going to be a huge pain. And I didn't realize like the pain you had to go through before this until I started seeing like some of the code that you started to deal with. Like I think you tweeted out like a few questions about how to deal with forms, but then you had an example of where you're using Angular formally, and I was like, holy crap! Like there's so much like going on in this particular this particular site.
Well, it might be good just for some of the stuff you're talking about, Patrick, if Ken can kind of go over some like specific examples of like for people who haven't used Angular formally before, where it provides like a lot of benefit.
Yeah. So I gave it a talk at NGNL in February about Angular formally, and in it I describe a very common scenario. Let's say that you're a web developer, you're using Angular, you're really excited because of this declarative syntax you have in the DOM or in your template, and your boss comes to you and says, "Hey, I need to have an input that accepts a first name," and so you say, "Great, I have my input tag, I have ngModel as the first name, and then I'm done." And then your boss is like, "Yeah, nobody really knows what that's for. You're going to need a label," so you put a label on it, and you're like, "Okay, great." And then Marcy Sutton comes to you and says, "Hey, that's not accessible at all. Nobody knows that label is associated with that input." And so you say, "Okay, I'll put an ID on that input, and I'll put a for attribute on the label to associate the two." Then she's happy. And then your designer comes and says, "Hey, I need, like we're using Bootstrap or whatever, like this needs a class so that we can style it so it looks nice." So then you add a class. And then somebody else comes to you and says, "Hey, that's a really cool thing that you have there. I'd like to reuse it," so you create a directive, and then you're both using this thing, and this is great. And then somebody comes to you and says, "I need it to be required sometimes, so could you add an ng required on there?" "Yeah, sure." So now you have a watcher, like right from there, you have a watcher in place for one person's use case, but you don't need it in your use case. And your use case, it is never required, so you're just kind of wasting a watcher in that case. But it's abstracted away, and so like it's better to not repeat code than it is to worry about those watchers. So you're fine. But then these things keep on pouring in. Oh, I need it disabled sometimes, or I need it. I have this like max length and min length, all these different validations that you need on it sometimes. And so you start thinking, well, this is starting to get bloated. Maybe I should make a MAC address directive, or maybe I'd make an IP address directive that is an input that is validated as an IP address, so that I don't bloat this one case. But it just gets to be a real big hairy mess really quickly, because you're either writing a bunch of different directives to account for all these cases, or you are bloating a single directive to make it cover more use cases. And so, yeah, it's a real pain. And what angularformly actually does is it analyzes your field configuration, and it can tell, based on your configuration, whether something is ever going to change. And so it knows what kind of attributes to use based on your field configuration. And so even though the template for an input element may be the same, because the field configuration is different, it will add a required attribute. But that doesn't add a watcher, it's just a required attribute, because you told angularformly, I'm never going to change this. But then if you say, hey, I am going to change this attribute, then angularformly will add an ng-required attribute. Or if you say it's never going to be required ever, it just leaves it off entirely. So there's a lot of smarts in angularformly to make this so like it's optimized in that way. And that applies to also like ng-clicks and ng-blur and like a ton of different attributes, and you can add your own and that kind of thing. So anyway, the main use case that this solves is the problem of loading your directives or making tons of directives so that you can cover all the use cases that you need to, and instead you put those different use cases where they belong as part of the specific field configuration object without bloating your template for that particular view. Does that make sense? That's kind of long. I like to talk.
No. So, I have a question. I think that, in my opinion, one of the strengths of Angular is that you're allowed to do your layout in a declarative context. And so having your layout simply be HTML that you're extending, I know we've talked about this before, Kent, but a pretty common scenario that I find myself in is that you have the designer types that will actually come up with the design and then do the layout. And because it's all declarative HTML, it just sits in there. And then as Angular developers, we're able to just pick that up and then within the controllers apply our kind of imperative logic that we want to apply to the view. And how does this affect kind of the designer-developer workflow by actually taking out, what traditionally, kind of designer types have done and just lay something out in the HTML, and now you're abstracting that, back out into an imperative context. And so you're kind of breaking that workflow there from, here's your HTML, hook up Angular to, like, this is, a form should be here, but we don't know formally, so you have to do it now.
Yeah, good question. So I'll preface that by saying I've never actually worked at a company where the designer committed any source code. So it was all the places that I've been, big or small, the designer would give us a mock and we would build it ourselves. But I would imagine that designers would actually really like formally, and the reason is that with Angular formally, the idea is that it's as dry as possible. So you make your input here, and you say, my input looks like this, and it has a label, and it looks like this, and that exact same label applies to these other fields as well. And so the designer can design those pieces as kind of isolated components, and then they can say, hey, I'm not going to put the form in here. You can do your crazy JavaScript weirdness. But what I want to see here are a bunch of, we need fields for these different things, and these are their types. They're actually two UI builders. And actually, I think there are a couple of people who've mentioned that they're making drag and drop UI builders using angularformly. And so there are two open source ones. You can find them in the docs. And so I could really easily see a designer coming in and just using something like that and saying, hey, make this, and they just give you the formally output for it.
Oh yeah, there was I forget the name of the company, but there was a vendor at AngularU that Patrick, do you remember the name of them that did forms? I'm curious whether they either use formally or like Kent is aware of them. Do you know who I'm talking about, Patrick?
I think you're talking about one of the sponsors for the event. They were talking about something similar that they had. I kind of forgot what it was though.
Yeah, I haven't heard of any company that has built a GUI using angularformly. I know several people, well, people who work for companies, so yes, companies, but not as part of their product. But they're actually now maybe I'll just mention as part of a segue. I recently found out that Capital One is using angularformly. I was like, total validation right there. It's pretty cool.
That's nice. It was form.io, they're called.
And are they using Angular then?
They are using Angular, but I think they're doing their own thing. But yeah, obviously, I was curious if you were aware of them, but it sounds like you weren't.
I wasn't. I'll have to chat with them.
So you mentioned that Capital One is now using formally, so I mean, I would probably ask for stock options as a result of that. But what is the best and worst parts of just running a massively popular and awesome, super awesome open source project?
So best parts, I really love that if it takes me an hour to implement a feature, or even like a day, I know that feature is going to help people and save days and weeks of time, months of time, who knows, depending on how many people use it. So that is really, really rewarding. And when I get somebody sends a tweet to me and says, hey, Kent, this is amazing. Thank you so much for building this. This saved me forever. Or I was going to build something like this myself. I'm so glad you saved me the time. And I'm thinking, yeah, because this took me forever. So I'm glad that it saved you time too. Yeah, so like being able to help people in that way is super, super rewarding. And it's also nice because we use it here at work very, very heavily, and so that's helpful too. And then also getting contributions. So a couple, like a month or two ago, I started doing this thing where if I find a bug or a new feature in angularformly that I feel like is a pretty simple fix, I'll write tests that reveal the bug or will only pass when the feature exists, and I'll skip them. So I use Mocha, and so I just say describe.skip, and then I commit that and push it up, and then I'll create, or as part of the issue that's tracking this feature request or this bug, I'll say, okay, I've pushed these tests, here's where they are, and this issue is reserved for first-time contributors. So I won't accept a pull request from anybody who's contributed to open source before. And so it, because I've had several pull requests from the same people, and I think it's super awesome. I really appreciate these pull requests. But I really feel like it's valuable for people to get into open source for the first time, because it's really not that bad, and it's a lot of fun, but it's kind of hard to know where to start. And so I reserve these issues, and then I go and tweet and go to Angular Buddy Slack or wherever, and I say, hey, if you never contributed to open source before, here's your chance. I'll hold your hand. And in that issue, I give a bullet point list, like, these are the things that need to happen. These are where you're going to add code, and I'll totally hold your hand. So I've been hit up on Gitter or Slack, and like we just chatted back and forth. They say, hey, this is what I'm thinking, and oh yeah, that's this, whatever. Just kind of hold their hand to get their first contribution into open source. So that is super rewarding as well. I've had, I think, 2 or 3 people who contributed to open source for the first time in Angular formally from doing that.
That's awesome, man.
Great. That's incredible. So let's actually go back to ground zero. Like, how did you even get started in this project? Like, in what deep, dark part of your soul did Formally come from?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked that. So if you go to the Angular Formally homepage, angularformally.com, and scroll down to the bottom, you will notice that it says Angular Formally was created by the good folks at Nimbly, specifically Grant Helton, and is actively developed by Kenzie Dodds. So I didn't actually create Angular Formally. It was about a year and a half ago that I was moonlighting for a company called Parakeet, and it was just a huge CRUD app. And I don't like repeating myself, and I ran into this problem that I described where I had to keep on putting a label here and different things, and something would be broken over here because I was copy pasting. Like, that's just what you do with HTML. I mean, you've got directives and stuff, so don't get me wrong. Don't just copy paste your HTML. But anyway, it was just a real pain, and so I was like, I wonder if there's a way that I could configure my form somehow. And so I looked around, and I found Angular Formally. Yeah, Angular Formally, formally developed by Nimbly. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, if only our viewers could see what we chat sometimes. Anyway, so I found Angular Formally, and I was like, this is awesome, this is perfect. And so I implemented it, and it was working great. At the time, it was a lot different from where it is now. The concepts were still the same. You had a JSON object, you had your model, but there were a lot fewer features. And so one thing that was missing was the ability to conditionally hide something. And so I added that pull request and got accepted. And then it just kind of snowballed from there. I started adding more and more to the project, and eventually Grant said, hey, our company is not really using this as much anymore. We're happy to work on it, but it's not really making sense. But obviously you are very invested in this. Would you be willing to take it over? And I said, yeah, I'd love it. And so that was, like I said, about a year and a half ago, and I've just been working on it and developing it ever since.
And so how would you attribute the massive popularity of the Angular Formally project? Like, we were hanging out the other day, walking down the street, and people are coming up wanting your autograph because you're the Formally guy. It was so surreal. I mean, you're practically you're just a celebrity now. How did Formally get so popular, and what are you going to do with all the millions of dollars you've made off this project?
Wow. If only I had made $1 million off this project. But yeah, so the popularity, I think, of the project is, first off, people are actually using this project, and so it's not just this project is associated to me and I'm an Egghead developer and I do Angular Air, and so people like it because I made it. I really don't think that's what it is. Maybe there's a little bit of that. But I think what it mostly is that the project actually speaks to developers' needs. They're tired of not being able to be dry in their forms. They want to be able to persist their forms to a database somewhere. I get a lot of use cases where people are doing that. And so Formally allows you to not only persist a static form to your database, but also make it dynamic, even as it's stored as a string or as a JSON object, and it can have some dynamic even validation things. And so it solves a real problem. And then on top of that, I guess I'm a bit of a marketer, and I reached out to JavaScript Weekly and NG Newsletter, and I said, hey, there's this thing, and I think you should feature it. And they did, and I got a lot of traffic from that. I'm also an Egghead author, and so I made a handful of Egghead lessons about using Angular Formally. The website is chock full of examples. I don't even know how many there are here, probably about 50 examples, so it's really easy to get started. And the documentation, I feel, is pretty darn good. So yeah, I think all of those things kind of combined to making Angular Formally just really easy to accept into your normal workflow.
Well, so it sounds like even though you weren't the original creator formally, you sort of adopted it as your own. It's like your baby now, right?
Yeah.
So, like you mentioned earlier, how probably moving forward, with the capabilities of form manipulation in Angular 2, that you would work on kind of the transition type plan, but then maybe Angular formally would even go away. But doesn't that is that something hard for you to think about, or do you actually feel relieved that oh, this has been a great project, and then I'll eventually one day it'll be kind of over somewhat? Or what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, good question. So first I'll say that I know I've actually in the last couple of days had two or three people come to me and say, hey, Angular 2 informally, is it a thing? And I'll just answer that really quick. It's not a thing yet, and it will be. So I have talked with Victor Sopkin, who's from the Angular team working on forms with Angular, and I described to him, hey, this is how Angular formally works. Is this something that can be a thing in Angular 2? And he's like, yeah, that's totally possible. And this is kind of what you would do. So I know that I'll be able to accomplish the same thing, and at least get us to a transition where people don't have to upgrade all of their forms just to upgrade to Angular 2. And for many apps, forms are a huge component, and so just being able to say, okay, instead of just taking the exact same form configuration I was giving formally before, I'll give it to formally 2, and everything still works. That's a huge, huge bonus. But like I said, that's not a thing yet, and there may be some breaking changes necessary, but hopefully minor and a lot easier to migrate if you're using formally than if you're not.
If I'm hearing you correctly, I mean, you're saying that potentially in an ideal world, formally would still be there, but maybe just underneath the scenes, Angular 2 would be driving it, with their form capabilities, but you would still have the same kind of APIs, the same feel as what you've kind of built so far.
Yeah, and it kind of depends. I haven't really built a big form with Angular 2's form API. I expect that it's a lot nicer than Angular 1. Not to say that Angular 1 isn't great, but it may be that I feel like Angular formally the Angular formally API is still simpler than Angular 2's API, and if that's the case, then I will likely continue to develop it. But my hope is that we don't need it, and so once people migrate to Angular 2 and Angular 2 formally, then they can slowly migrate from Angular 2 formally to just Angular 2. So that I'm not totally certain on how that will all pan out, but that's kind of the hope. And to say my sunsetting my baby Angular formally, I'd be totally pleased to see Angular formally go away and the needs of Angular formally to go away. I think that'd be great. There are so many other I have plenty of libraries that I work on other than Angular formally that I get a kick out of. So yeah, I'm not worried about not having enough open source work to do if Angular formally dies or it's not needed.
So you keep using a lot of big words, which is totally awesome when you're talking about this totally awesome project, which I think is great. But let's have some real talk here. Time to see the wizard behind the curtain. Kent, what has been the single biggest challenge you've come across building formally? And enough time is not a valid option or answer. I mean, let's just bare your heart. Just lay your soul bare for our viewers to know, what the pain and the tribulation of building formally.
Recently the hardest or the worst part is performance, and lots of it has to do with kind of the way that Angular works, but lots of it has to do with the way Angular formally works. So I'll just describe really quick at a high level how Angular formally works. So you need to tell Angular formally what does an input look like. So Angular formally ships with no templates whatsoever. It doesn't know what an input looks like or even what an input is. It just knows how to deal with these different types. And so you say, hey, formally, here's a new type, and it's called, I have a name for it, it's called an input. And I have a template for it, it looks like this. And I have all these different options. You can give it a controller even, or a link function. In some ways, you could think of it as a little bit of a directive, but it's not often that you really need to use those things. But anyway, sometimes you do, and they're available, and they're really, really handy. But you say, hey, angularformly, this is what an input looks like. And then off in your controller somewhere else, you say, hey, angularformly, here's my field configuration. And as part of your field configuration, you say, the type of this field is input. And so then it can associate the template that you told angularformly an input looks like this, and that field where you're saying, hey, this field is an input. But then there are a bunch of other configuration options that you can add to that. For example, you can, as part of the type or the specific field, you can specify wrappers. And so basically a wrapper is just a string template, an HTML template, that has a formally transclude element in it. And that actually never gets added to the DOM. It's just a string find replace. So basically, it's useful for labels. So you can have a label wrapper, and you apply that to your input type and your date picker type and your select type, all these different, like whatever types. But you just have that one place where you have that code for label. And so wrappers are a huge thing. So when angularformly compiles your form, it has to take your initial input type, get that template, and it combines it with a wrapper. But then another thing that it does is, because it's dynamically adding these required or disabled or ng-click or whatever these different attributes to your ng model, it has what's called a template manipulator. So it will, after it wraps your stuff, or before, you can kind of fine-tune it that way. But it will run through this template manipulator where you can, based on the field configuration, change the string that you're using for the template, and then you just return the result. And so that's kind of how the magic works with these kind of dynamic attributes like required versus ng required. It knows when to put one or the other, and that happens inside of a template manipulator. And you can add your own as well. And so it has to, so first you give it the field type, or you specify a field type, and then when you use the formally form directive, you give it a field configuration. You say this type is input, and formally will look up the template for that type, and then it will wrap it in all of its wrappers, run it through all of the template manipulators, and then compile that and spit it out to the DOM. So that's at a high level how formally works. So some of the problems associated with that is I'm using Webpack, and so I can require my templates, and at the time I ship it out to, and this is in my app, at the time I ship my stuff out to the browser, I don't need to use the template cache at all, and so I don't need to worry about whether or not these templates are actually available to me. But many people are not doing that, and so they need to asynchronously get their template. So instead of specifying the inputs template, you specify the inputs template URL, and then angularformly has to go get that. And so just from that one thing alone, you introduce asynchronicity into the link function, where angularformly is generating this template to stick into the DOM. Also, the wrappers are the same way. You can specify a template URL, so that needs to be asynchronous. And the template manipulators can actually also be asynchronous. And so that's part of the performance problem is you're wrapped up in all of these different promises. And so the initial compile time can be a little bit slow.
So why haven't you written everything in React yet?
Actually, there is a React formally, so if you're interested, that's why the org name is formally.js, not angularformly, because React formally is a thing. And I actually started that one, and then Grant Helton has picked it up, so we kind of swapped places. Yeah. Anyway, so that's one side of the problem. I actually implemented a synchronous mode. Just to see if that would speed things up. And so I said, if it's synchronous mode, just run all these things synchronously. Nothing's like you can't return a promise or anything. it actually didn't change performance very much or even noticeably. So, which I thought was really odd. Patrick actually has helped me work through this, and there's something weird, but I can't really quite figure out what the performance problems are. So that's kind of looming over my head, is that initial compile time performance on big forms. Small forms you can't even, you can't tell. But on huge forms with lots of complexity, the initial compile time takes a second. Then after it's all been compiled, then the form is faster than if you made it by hand in a sane way, because we're only adding the watchers that you absolutely need. So yeah, that's just been a huge challenge. And I implore anyone out there in the world who is into performance to please help me figure out what we can do to speed up angularformly, because there are a lot of projects using angularformly now, and I'd love to be able to speed every one of them up.
We actually have a question from the audience. We have an audience member here today.
Mike.
How's it going? So, Ken, I hear all this talk about all these forms and different types and blah, blah, blah. They're all cool. Where can I get some forms that actually look good and have some nice styling? And they also need to work. This new idea I'm playing with, virtual reality. Is it going to work in my Oculus Rift?
I'm you're giving there are types defined. Hey, Jeff, there you go. Thank you. Yeah, there are types or type libraries. So, like I said, the angularformly doesn't ship with any predefined types. It doesn't know what an input looks like. You have to tell it yourself. But lots of people don't really care to fine-tune what things look like, and so we have 5, I think, libraries that define these types for you, and you just include them in your project, and boom, everything works. And so the example website mostly uses Bootstrap, because I think that's like a huge majority of the users of angularformly are Bootstrap. And so you'll find that the website is full of examples that use the Bootstrap library, but there's also an Ionic template library that Mike over here has created and is maintaining, and it's super awesome. And I believe that, Mike, that is virtual reality ready, right?
So.
Yeah, almost there. And then
there's some testing needed.
We're working on foundation templates, and we've got, I think there's still vanilla JS or vanilla HTML templates, and I know Angular material templates are in progress, as well as Lumix, which is a different implementation of material design. So there are these different template libraries that you can use and plop them into your project, and they should just work. So yeah. But I should mention, in my project, all of my templates are I made myself. I think that it's I recommend to everybody that they make your own custom templates, because you're the one who's closest to the design of what you want them to look like. But the Bootstrap templates are really good if you're using Bootstrap and you don't really care as much. You just want to spit out a form. So.
Cool.
Yeah, so, that's really interesting, because more on the formally JS part, like we're starting to see a trend of libraries and frameworks moving towards more of a universal approach, where you have just JavaScript, but then you just have like a wrapper around it to run on, like you can even say like a different framework for like Bootstrap or Foundation and everything, and that's pretty cool. Do you think you're going to be moving more in that direction in order to decouple formally even more and start doing a lot more integrations?
Yeah, so one thing that I really admire is Jason Debris made a library called JS Data that I totally love. But it wasn't originally JS Data, it was originally Angular Data, and that's when I started using it. And Matt Zabriskie and I were talking, and we suggested to him, hey, like, you should probably see if you could pull out Angular, and like, how hard would that be? And he'd already been thinking about it, I think. And so in like a night or two, because he's just a monster coder, he pulled out Angular, and it totally worked. And so now tons of people can benefit from JS Data, and then he just has an adapter for Angular. Super, super cool. So that's something that I'd love to be able to do with angularformly, especially since we have React formally. I'd love to be able to share as much logic as possible. So if for some crazy reason you wanted to go to React, you wouldn't have to convert your fields and your stuff. You just take the same configuration, move it over. And on top of that, even better or more likely use cases, if you wanted to upgrade to Angular 2, having some sort of core library would make that a lot easier as well. So yeah, that's definitely something I'd like to do. That would take a whole lot of work, and I don't know if I have time to do that. But if anybody wants to try it out as a thought experiment, that'd be pretty cool.
I could definitely help with that.
That'd be awesome.
Yay! So I think we're almost out of time. Do we have any questions and answers from the Hangout/Twitter?
Looks like we do have 2 questions in Twitter. You want
For you can ask the question and answer the question.
These are actually both from people who are using Angular formally, and I talk with them regularly. So the first one is Benjamin Orozco. I think I said your name right. I'm sorry. But he said, in the future, it will be possible to reuse the same form configuration for both Angular 2 formally and React formally. That would be cool. That kind of goes back with what I talked about with extracting as much as possible outside of the core Angular formally library and just make a formally JS library. And actually, I should mention that somebody brought a bunch. There are more libraries that do what Angular formally does. That is, like, take a JSON configuration object and spit out a form. There are several popular ones. Angular formally is probably the most popular, but somebody brought us all together and said, hey, we're all working on the same stuff. Why don't we work together? And the result of that conversation was a library called Forms.js. And I don't think there's been any development on that for quite some time, so that kind of fizzled out. But that's kind of what I see React or Angular formally being, is pulling out as much as possible into a vanilla JS solution that you can use with whatever, and then making an Angular 2 version, and that just like hooks into the different pieces, and a React version, and an Angular 1 version, and a Ember version, and a Web Components version, and whatever Polymer version. So in the future, that might be possible. Whether or not that actually happens is up to you, or if you can convince me to take the time. But it really takes a lot of time, so we'll see. So then Erwin Dotton asks the question, nice question. I ask myself the same. So he was actually responding to Benjamin. So yeah, that's it for our Twitter questions.
All right, it's pick time. Let's start with Patrick JS. What are your picks, buddy?
All right, so so there's this new feature that's coming out in Angular 2 that I really, really like, and that's ng content and reprojection. Basically, it's a great performance boost for Angular 2, and that's basically like content. It's a little, I don't know if I want to get into it, but essentially, you're able to specify your templates in the DOM, and you're able to say, project this one. You look at this one and look at this one, and that's pretty awesome. It's going to take a little bit to explain now, but I shouldn't get into it. But my other pick is universal JavaScript, and we're starting to see the trend. Everyone moving more towards it. Libraries, frameworks, everyone's moving to more of like, this is just JavaScript, and then you have your own like adapters for everything else, and that's going to be pretty awesome.
Yay, Jeff, hit me. What do you got?
So my first pick is Patrick JS. The guy's never met. Guy's never met a project he doesn't like. In fact, this week I think he's signed up for like three or four more projects. There's Dan Abramoff wanted somebody to do an Angular integration to Redux, and of course Patrick jumped in. I think he signed up for one during this show, so he's awesome. Second one is sleep. Sleep is great. Wish I had more of it, and that's it for me.
And Kent.
So I saw something really hilarious today. Emoji Translate. I'll put a link in the notes of the show, but it's hilarious. So basically, you type in like just words, whatever, and it will change your words to emoji. So like if you type OMG, it does like the freaked out face, and if you type house, it does a house, and fire, it does a fire, whatever, and donuts and stuff. It's hilarious. So yeah, check out Emoji Translate.
All right, and since I'm the host, I will go last. And my pick is a book that I've been reading called Exploring ES6 by Axel Rauschmeier. And it is just a really good write-up on ES6. I really actually like his style. It's very comprehensive, thorough, and it has a lot of really good examples. So I've been going through it kind of in pieces, and he's just an excellent writer, really knows his stuff, and I cannot recommend it enough. And on that note, I'm going to use this opportunity to get to our announcements once more. So remember, tune in for the next show, Angular and Modulating with Guy Bedford, creator of JSPM. It's going to be super awesome, July 21st. Be sure to follow us on Twitter and Google Plus at AngularAir. And if you have any questions posthumous of this episode, go ahead and just shoot that out as well, and we'll make sure that Kent answers those in the middle of the night when he is doing nothing.
Yeah, it'll alert me. No, just kidding.
Yes. So many questions then spread throughout the night is what I recommend. And so this has been Luke C. Dodds. I have nothing more to add to this episode. It is perfect just the way it is, and thank you for your time.
I'm going to add a couple of things.
Whoa. Oh. You can't improve upon perfection there, Kent.
I'm so sorry. I totally ruined your outro. Mic dropped from you, and then I picked it back up. But I wanted to mention, if anybody's interested to get into angularformly, I have worked tirelessly on making it really easy to get started so that you don't have to ask me questions. Not that I mind answering your questions. I love answering questions, but we're all busy, and I think that you would be more benefited if you could find answers easily. So first off, angular-formly.com is the official website, and it is the example. It's full of examples. So like I said, like 50 or more examples of how to use angularformly and different things that you can do with it, and different integrations with other libraries and stuff. There's also the documentation website, and so that's docs.angularformly.com, and that is pretty very well documented. There's also the mailing list, so if you go to mailing-list.angular-formly.com, there's Gitter chat, so chat.angular-formly.com, and if you need help using AngularFormly, then just go to help.angular-formly.com, and it will take you to a JS bin with instructions on the best way that you can get help. And then also, obviously I've got a bunch of these subdomain shortcut links, but you can find them all on the official GitHub page at github.com/formly-js, formly-js/angular-formly. And there's a bunch of links, and one other one that I should note is learn.angular-formly.com will take you to the docs page about how you learn AngularFormly. There's a bunch of egghead lessons, and it points to other resources for you to learn AngularFormly. So, yeah, thought I should just mention that before we close out, so people know where to go.
That felt like the disclaimer to a pharmaceutical commercial.
Yeah.
Like, Formally, it's awesome. By the way, may cause bowel movement dysfunction, child care, and so on. So,
basically.
We just got to get the disclaimer out there. So, thank you, Kent, for dropping that knowledge bomb on us.
Yeah.
All right. Are we done now? Do I need to drop the mic again?
Yeah, you can drop it again.
All right. You guys have been fantastic. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
See you guys.